We live inside a construct below a vast programmed illusion that we call the sky. It is filled with mystery, a detailed picture that shows us either events that happened long ago or those that will transpire in the future. It is easy to be confused. It's easy because we're trained to believe that we exist in a real world, in a real cosmos. Those who haven't really processed and understood the Archaix model quickly leap to dismissal. And it's okay. It just, when I read these comments, I recognize exactly where you are. You know, you're comfortable in your paradigm. I hear the moon is a reflection of the Earth's continents. The world is flat, so nothing you say could be true about the sky. I hear the moon is a hologram, so how can holograms fall? I see this merging, this attempt to marry other paradigms in with the Archaix data. Everything in the sky is simulated. I have never been more clear about that. So when you hear about planets and worlds and you hear, where is this coming from? So let's get to that in this video. But that the moon we see today was not always in our sky automatically brings into dismissal many things that are believed about it. If we can show that there was a period in our history where the moon did not exist, and that its appearance suddenly caused a major cataclysm, then this automatically nullifies some popular theories across YouTube and social media. But let's resort to Hans Horberger and Hans Bellamy and see what they said a century ago about these things. Let's not rely on Jason. I just want to bring some things to your attention. I know that we live in the simulacrum, and this field is always teaching us, showing us probable paths and possible futures. So, in 1901, Hans Schindler Bellamy was born. He is the author of the research in this video. And at this exact same time of 1901 and 1902 and 1903, Hans Horberger was formulating a totally new radical theory of world history that the scientific establishment would later make war against. They ignore people like me. They ignore people that don't have the credentials to even be peer-reviewed. But Hans Horberger was a threat because he was an inventor and he was a great critical mind and he was peer-reviewed. Hans Horberger was Austrian, and he's the origin of the cosmic ice theory, which was published in 1913 in collaboration with Philip Foth, he was one of the leading selenologists at the time. Selenology is the study of the science of the moon. So a new edition was published in 1925, and that's when the scientific world pounced. The excerpts that you will see in this video are amazing, and the theory helps us understand the origin of not only the moon, of the pre-flood world civilizations, of the great flood that followed long after the capture flood, but it also helps us understand what the symbols of the apocalypse are in Revelation, what they refer to. Remember, Genesis and Revelation are the Alpha and Omega texts, and this work really does help us understand just how deep this rabbit hole goes with the scriptures. This is Moons, Myths, and Man by H.S. Bellamy, published in 1931 in defense of the cosmic ice theory. Alright guys, this is not going to be an ordinary presentation that I do. We're going to fly through this. We have a lot of data to cover. So in order to establish that Bellamy really knew what he was talking about, and before we examine more of the capture flood data, let's explore what this man really knew. Let's see what he brings to the table. How does it comport with the Archaix output? I think you guys might be surprised. But like I said, this isn't going to be an ordinary presentation. We're going to fly through this. And I have my notes right here under my camera. And Bellamy starts off by going through many ancient legends and myths, traditions, something that Hans Boehringer did not do. Hans Boehringer stuck to the science. Hans Bellamy brought a lot more to the table in 1931 to support the cosmic ice theory about the moon and its relationship to our world. So he goes and he explains the Thunderbird of ancient times that was so feared by the Native Americans, and gives a lot of associations, and explains that the Thunderbird was nothing but the dragon of the old world. In fact, he goes into a lot of detail about there are two dragons that periodically show up in the sky, and they bring cataclysms. But the ancients always knew that these destructions were they weren't caused by a single dragon. There were two different dragons that appeared over. And he says this, and he shows all these associations in different ancient records. What shocked me when I read the book is now a lot of the things in the biblical material that has been sanitized about Behemoth and Leviathan make sense. You'll have to read his book to go into all those details, but he explains how the creation of the world, the dragons were responsible for everything. So, yeah, it's really, he goes into the Armenian feathered monster called Van and the Egyptian phoenix. He taught me something about the phoenix. I did not know that in Egyptian the phoenix was well known. It was called Bakbahu, or Bakbahu, which means to water or to flood. But the designation for the phoenix in the Egyptian hieroglyphs was three wavy lines, from which we got Aquarius. So the flood. And you guys already know from my research, the phoenix is what caused the Great Flood in 2239 BC. So I got a much appreciation for this material because he's coming from a different vantage point, and he's being very specific that the capture flood that involved the moon has nothing to do with the later Great Flood of biblical fame. So I thought that's another very interesting point. So he explains an old cuneiform text at the time of the Great Flood. It was called the Year of the Raging or Red Shining Serpent, Year of the Serpent, in the old antediluvian calendars. And he explains in Jewish myths, we are told that Leviathan and Behemoth always appear before a flood. In fact, and remember, Leviathan and Behemoth are the two dragons that appear in the sky. In all the dragon myths, the monsters only appear in times of stress. Yeah, I'm not going to go into all his dragon material. It's a lot. So this book endeavors to show that the dragon myths and their inseparably close companions, the deluge and creation myths, are reports of the cataclysmic end of the tertiary age, of the catastrophic breakdown of the predecessor of our present moon. In cosmic ice theory, we have a situation of two moons being in the ancient world, but they weren't here at the same time. There was a moon here before the moon that we have now, and it totally fragmented and broke apart and caused an epic cataclysm. Later on, this other moon appeared, the one for which we have in the sky now. And there was a period of time when civilizations were recording that there was no moon in the sky. This was the time between those two moons. So this is the cosmic ice theory as presented by Hans Boehringer and Hans Bellamy. So he goes into depth about the Greek mythology about Typhon. I showed you Typhon as Fiend, the Fiend, Typhon. It's the youngest son of Gaia and Tartarus, Typhon being the phoenix. He goes into detail about how the phoenix brings flames. Zeus tried to attack it with a thunderbolt, but the actual phoenix from the ancient world is the personification of volcanic and seismic forces. Remember all the volcanoes and all the earthquakes that I have documented that were all attached to phoenix phenomenon dates? Yeah, he goes into that. And his theory is not about the phoenix. These are just things he's throwing out there as he's giving his dissertation about all the traditions in the world and how they differ from certain threads of traditions that are about the moon. He mentioned sea crops. Sea crops appeared and started Athens after a cataclysm. Uh, he says, after the great flood, men were found no more. The hills and valleys were covered with a fine loam and loess, a legacy of the dead satellite, which was recognized as being a new, unfamiliar thing. Its brownish or reddish color all over the ground was taken as evidence that it was the material into which the dead had been transformed. So this cataclysm occurs in ancient times. Something breaks open the sky. It rains all over the ground, and the survivors see this red mud. They see this everywhere, and in their minds, this is what happened to their moms and dads and brothers and sisters and wives and husbands. What's left over after this cataclysm, because all the people are gone. The people are gone, and what's left is all this fallout, red fallout from the sky. Yeah, I couldn't believe when I read that. I was like, wow. Another thing that Hans Bellamy brought to my attention that I did not know about previously, I got it from his research, was that he says the epic of the mundane era of the Maya, on the other hand, was established in the year 3373 BC. I have that in Chronicon. So, and then he says, by their calculation, it went by heptads of Bactans, or 2,760 years. He's claiming the Maya were measuring the periodicity of the appearance of the dragons in the sky. And he says that their chief measurement was 2760 years. This is divisible by 138 and by the Phoenix cycle of 552. Hans Bellamy did not know the Phoenix cycle of, Hans Bellamy knows nothing about the 138-year chronology of Phoenix, nor the Phoenix epicycles that we call Phoenix cycles of 552 years. He doesn't know anything about that, but he knew this number from a Mayan text. That right there is profound. That's a data point. I need to add that to all my other ones. So, he goes into Peruvian legends that talk about the Great Flood, and he shows that in those Peruvian and ancient American legends, the Great Flood is very similar to the one in the Bible, like the flood of Noah. It is totally dissimilar to the massive flooding that happened when the moon appeared. Two different events. He said at the Great Flood of the ancient Americas, it lasted for 5 days, in which the entire time the sun was obscured. And I've showed this in my own research, that the Great Flood in 2239 BC, the sun darkened, which is a part of the Phoenix phenomenon. Let's see. He properly identifies Typhon and Phoenix with the ancient Egyptian Set. He says it right here, they are the same, and that they even had a nickname for Set, which was Apepi, the dragon of darkness. Both Apepi and Set are regarded as lords of evil and darkness, and Apepi is also called the Roarer. This is very, very intriguing. Remember, Phoenix brings this thundering humming coming from the sky that vibrates all kinds of physical objects. Yeah, causes liquefaction, all that stuff. So it's calling Apepi, Phoenix, Typhon, Set. It's all the same phenomenon. It's all described in ancient texts as being the very same. They are all just epithets for the Phoenix. And he's saying right here, the roarer Apepi is Set. Yeah, Hans Bellamy, he knew his history. There's no doubt. And we're going to get into that. He's very impressive. So he makes a statement. I'm showing it on the screen now. The awkward question which still remains to be answered is, why did those contemporaries of tremendous events, those deluge heroes, those divine ancestors who stood at the separation line of two world ages, why did they not call things by their real names and describe the overpowering thing in the heavens as a dying satellite instead of a living dragon? This is a very good point, but it's one that's covered in Archaix numerous times. So much that I can understand why many of you would miss what I'm about to say. He is asking the reader, why didn't they just call a spade a spade? Why didn't they just call it a dragon if it looked like a dragon in the sky? I mean, why didn't they call it a satellite if the moon, whatever? But I have already explained multiple times that there wasn't any, we didn't transmit information written out the way they did in ancient Sumer and Babylon on clay tablets, burning them into kilns, because when this event occurred, the infrastructure was sophisticated, and we were writing on tablets or holographic templates and technological devices. We had technology, and he goes into this. You're gonna hear in this presentation that he even goes into detail about massively advanced technologies existing in the ancient past. The moonfall of the old world ended that infrastructure. So these things were transmitted to us through more primitive frames of reference, because 200 and 300 years later, they had lost everything. We're going to get into that because he can say things better than I can explain to you. I'm going to read for you what he has to say about these things. They're very interesting. So we now move on, and we're going to look at what Bellamy says about the Tower of Babel and the Great Pyramid. He says the biblical tower myth becomes clear, however, if we regard the tower as what it really was, as a model of the mountain which safeguarded the ancestors, a model which, to a certain extent, practically, but chiefly magically, was in its turn to save the sons from the deluge. The Tower of Babel story, according to him, was just that, a story after the flood. But what it's really talking about was the building of the Great Pyramid as a way to save the descendants of the builders. That's profound, and it's very relevant to the Archaix output. So he says, according to the myth preserved in the Bible, this tower of theirs was never finished. What's missing on the top of the Great Pyramid? From the very beginning, I told you guys that structure was never completed. Sorry about the little interruption. I turned my video off. My dogs are all going haywire. Okay. But Bellamy's revealing something to us very profound. So let's continue. The wicked wanted to escape this punishment concerning the flood when they're building the Great Pyramid. Hence the divine anger, and hence a certain amount of divine fear. For apparently the tower builders had other thoughts in their minds as well. And if their plans were not nipped in the bud, nothing will be restrained from them, which they had imagined to do. As the Lord said when he came down one day to have a look at the city and the tower which the children of men, a tribe of different race from the one that he favored, were building. Yeah, this guy's very well read. He may have had access to a lot of materials that we just don't have anymore. But this is some profound stuff. So he continues with Yosipon Mika Ben Gurion. This is a guy's name. This is a Jewish scholar's name who wrote Sagen der Juden, Volume 1. So maybe that's Saga of the Jews, or Legend. Sagen der Juden is Legends or Tales of the Jews, Volume 1. So it illustrates the memory of repeated floods and the necessity of propping the unstable firmament to prevent further cataclysms. The people of that time said, we know that in each eon, every 1656 years, the vault of heaven breaks to pieces. Let therefore strong pillars be built as supports, one in the north, one in the south, and one in the west. This tower here shall be the prop in the east. 1656 years is divisible by 138. All of you know who've been following my research. That's how long the great pre-flood period lasted. In the 1656th year, Phoenix appeared and the great flood destroyed the world. That's awesome. So he cites another Jewish myth, and maybe from the same book, I don't know. But On the next page he cites, he says, they built a tower high enough to withstand the onrush of waters, strong enough to resist fire. And in the tower, he said, and they said to themselves, and in the tower, let us put engines automatically discharging projectiles that kill anyone approaching who wants to take our stronghold by storm. So on the tower, they set a winged image. And he goes on all these other details. Then he says this, 1931. But the research was done before this. Hans Bellamy published robot guns with automatic range finders and aim indicators to be used against the god armed with thunderbolts. Even if this is only a myth in the ordinary sense of the word, an idle wonder tale, it is unique. He's still talking about the building of the Great Pyramid. His book is not about the Great Pyramid. So these are just asides all throughout his historical narrative. So he says, their towers were the buildings of heaven-storming titans, attempting an offensive at great odds. According to Bellamy, the Tower of Babel is just a story in the Bible that's actually masking a real event, which is the building of the Great Pyramid, and that the people built the Great Pyramid because they had an idea to oppose the gods. They knew the gods were bringing these destructions on them, and they wanted to put a stop to it. It's amazing to find these things in this old book. He said, we have shown the connection between the building of the towers and the Great Flood, a connection which is stressed by the myths themselves, whether they come from the Eastern Hemisphere or from the Western. But we do not want any misunderstanding to arise as to the age of the ziggurat, of Bur's Nimrod, or of the Cholula Pyramid in America, or of any other building now in existence, which may be classed under the tower heading. The myths are older than those buildings. That is amazing. He's absolutely correct. Bur's Nimrod isn't very old. It's in Iraq. Yeah, and the Cholula Pyramid is gigantic, but it's not the Tower of Babel. It's not the Great Pyramid, and it's not near as old. So he says, nevertheless, the pyramids jut out into our world from the days before the dawn of history. And he's right to an extent. They do, because the Great Pyramid of Giza, built and finished in 2815 BC, was finished before humans ever started transmitting writing onto perishable and non-perishable mediums. Because when it was built, we were technologically advanced. We didn't have any no reason to do all that. So now, let's go to the next section. So Bellamy, he goes into some detail about the vapor canopy, but he never calls it the vapor canopy. To him, it's the firmament above. And it was a ocean that was suspended high in the sky. He says that Genesis chapter 1, verses 3 through 5, he says, and God said, let there be light. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Bellamy says, what is meant is after a time, the thick cloud cover came down in tremendous hailstorms and cloudbursts, and the difference between an unbroken light time and an unbroken night time became distinctly marked. Bellamy goes into a lot of detail that Genesis 1 describes a cataclysm and the renovation, the healing of our world after a total destruction, something that I've told you many times and in many presentations provided you my own evidence. Bellamy spends a lot of time explaining this and how it relates to Genesis and Revelation. He says the snow mentioned in the above passages he's talking about the book of Ezekiel and other prophecies and eschatology. He says the snow mentioned in the above passages is really the wreckage from the old shattered firmament, which is professedly built of terrible ice. Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 22 and various Jewish myths. Recently, I have gone into detail about the glaciations and the false chronology of the ice ages, explaining that the collapse of the vapor canopy is what created that amount of snow. Here it is right here in Bellamy's own book. And this was his theory way back then. So remember, there's over 60 different theories as to how an ice age could even be possible. Scientists push it off as fact, but there are no scientists in agreement about how it could be possible, because it requires humidity in order to create that much snowpack ice all the way up, and we don't have that. There is no humidity at the polar extremes. That's why today they only get 1 inch of snow a year. So something major must have happened to put all that snow there. It would have been very fast. This is the difference between catastrophism and uniformitarianism. These are the only two schools of historical analysis. You're going to be one of the other. Many people think they're catastrophists, but they use uniformitarian dating. Therefore, they're uniformitarian. They're not catastrophists. A catastrophist admits that we go by the evidence, we go by the traditions, and that the world can be destroyed, and very suddenly. And then 400, 500, 600 years later, it can happen all over again. Uniformitarians is a different school, and it does its best to try to convey that all these catastrophes and all these events and myths and legends happened over hundreds of thousands and even millions of years. All untrue. So just remember that. That is the distinction between uniformitarianism and catastrophism. Catastrophists have all unlimited data. It's all over the world. Everybody can see it for themselves. Uniformitarians have to come up with all kinds of arbitrary and abstract procedures to say the things that they say. For a reason. They have to get you to agree that radioisotopes break down at a certain constant, because they can't have any variance. It would throw all their carbon-14 and potassium-argon dates off and all that. Yeah, it's just ridiculous. All the mental hoops we have to go through to accept uniformitarianism, when very simply you can just be a catastrophist and go by the evidence. So anyway, we have he says that there's an Aztec myth, says that the moon itself was undone by a great fire. In the beginning, the world was a dark place, though it was very dark in the world, as the sun had not yet been created. The goddess Medzith knew that this state of things could only be remedied by a great sacrifice, so she built a huge pyre upon which she burnt Nanhuatl, the leper. Then she threw herself onto the flames. Thereupon the sun appeared in the heavens. This is a vapor canopy collapse story. She's the goddess. She's the goddess. She's the moon goddess. She was attacked, which was the vapor canopy collapsing. Now she's no longer magnified at nighttime. Now she goes down to a smaller size. And now with the vapor canopy gone during the daytime, you can see the sun. You can see the sun just fine. Whereas before, all that light was diffused through the canopy, and you just saw a brightness, you never saw the sun. Now that all the sun calendars began, the Aztec myth is dead on. He said on another page that this goddess Medza, who is also addressed as the bright and dark lady of the heavens, was avowedly the moon goddess herself. I love reading these old books. He says, we can gather from the extent of the so-called continental shelves that up to a certain period in the Earth's past, generally considered to be the later tertiary age, the land area of our planet was considerably greater. Then, however, and probably rather suddenly, the shelves were submerged. The oceans, it is believed, received great quantities of water, which had been tied in the huge polar caps of the glacial period. We do not deny this, but this quantity would not have sufficed to raise the waters suddenly to their present level. We are therefore forced to seek their origin outside the earth. That's a profound statement, and I'm in total agreement. Because the waters that he's looking for, that he thinks were peeled off the surface of the moon and pulled onto the earth to raise the ocean levels, they were closer than the moon. They have nothing to do with the moon. The cosmic ice theory promotes that. But where the waters are that answers the mysteries of Hans Horbiger and Hans Bellamy is the collapse of the vapor canopy. That's where all the water came for them for the snow accrual at the poles and for the ocean levels to rise. It was the collapse of the canopy. So you can't fault him for not knowing that, though. Another thing he goes into is, I can't pronounce this, guys. You'll have to forgive me. My northern brothers and sisters in Europe, you just have to forgive me. Those of you who've got that Viking blood, I can't pronounce this. Vorspia Hadi of the Edda. It's called the Spilling Song, and it's called the Prelude to the End. But it's in the Rinda, one of the Eddas. But he goes into detail about it right here and explains that even the ancient Norse, they had a story, the Germans. Forspiallshhodh. I don't know how to say that, but the Spilling Song is about the day the sky fell. All this water spilled out of the heavens onto the earth. And he talks about the mud rains. It's just really, really interesting, all these legends and things. It's just so crazy. So when it talks about the firmament of heaven and all that, Hans Bellamy really says something profound. So I had never made this connection before because I have never looked at the book of Revelation the way that he does. I'm starting to now. So he says the revelation of John contains the words, a door was opened in heaven. And then he goes on to explain that the word heaven, Archaix, is descriptive of a great covering, a great shell around something else, a covering. I don't know. This intrigues me because of my research into other areas and other ancient enigmas. These eyewitness accounts also in the Bermuda Triangle when the sky corkscrews and they have a feeling they're looking at a door. I said, wow, here's a door in reality. It's perfect because the clouds, the ocean, the horizon, everything starts corkscrewing as if it's totally artificial. And that they're looking at an image and the whole image just starts contorting and it corkscrews. And the general impression of some of these pilots is that I'm looking at a door in the sky. And the door was cloaked. And it was cloaked by the very reality around us. And so if I have to accept their testimony as true when you read so much of it and they don't have any other, these people have put their credibility on the line. Some of them have lost their pilot's license for coming forth, coming out with a lot of these things. So I accept that as true, that many people have seen this because there's too many testimonies. So if that's true, I hear this about John sees a door was opened in the heaven. It kind of makes you wonder now, were there portals that allowed the vapor canopy to collapse? Is he talking about a portal out of the simulacrum, or is it just another layer of the holography, one that we can't perceive? I don't know, but he makes this point and he goes into detail about these deals quite a few times that I'm gonna have to go through more of Bellamy's books. I've read another book about the calendar of Tiwanaku, but he's got 2 or 3 other books I need to go ahead and search and see deeper into this man's mind because he's got some really interesting things. I just don't. I don't know. But anyway, we're gonna get into some more right now because Bellamy is gonna blow our minds now. Before we get into the actual history of the people before the moon and the moonfall, the cataclysm and all that. Here's some things that just shocked me. Just random. Here's about 8 or 9 random things in the book to demonstrate his erudition, how knowledgeable the man really was about the ancient world. He says the Mediterranean must be regarded as a very young sea because of the remarkable seismic and volcanic activity which we find in its basin. Remember, guys, I've cited the archaeological reports on my channel and the books of David Hatcher Childress. There are over 200 stone cities buried underwater in the Mediterranean. I have videos that explain that the Mediterranean was created in a day. In a day! When the Strait of Gibraltar broke at the Great Flood in 2239 BC, that Walter Pittman and William Ryan are absolutely wrong about their Black Sea flood date. They're almost precise in all their archaeology up until the time they dated it at 5600 BC. They're off. They're terribly off. And it's easy to show by the artifacts that are found, because they're contemporary with the 24th, 23rd, and 22nd century BC artifacts that are found and demonstrated in other areas local that were not flooded. So aside from that, I love their theory because it's absolutely true. All the damage on Malta, how gigantic megalithic blocks were strewn all in one direction. A tsunami came from the west to the east and blew it all apart and ended Malta. That's what the Great Flood ended Malta. All those great, huge temples like Hypogeum and all that. So to find that Bellamy was mentioning something like this is really shocking. I think there's another one. Yeah, the Mediterranean was not in existence at that time. In its place, there was a number of small seas or huge lakes, probably 3 in number. Again, blows my mind because it's true. The Mediterranean Ocean is it's a new sea. The Mediterranean Sea, the Aegean Sea, Tyrrhenian Sea, all that is absolutely new. Those were valleys full of people when that area flooded. So the Roman writer Claudius Aelian, he calls him Aelianus, but that's Latinized. Claudius Aelian, in his Varia Historia, a collection of rare and curious lore, tells us that the Greek historian Theopompus of Chios mentions a talk between King Midas, the king of Phrygia, and Silenus, in which the latter speaks of the existence of a great continent in the outer sea. Its inhabitants, the Meropes, were the builders of large cities. A lot of people believe that this is a reference. I've read all these little citations from Theopompus. Theopompus was awesome. Theopompus also told us that one of the first ages was 3,000 years. And he was dead on accurate. 5239 BC, the beginning of the Anunnaki nerd chronology, is precisely 3,000 years before 2239 BC, when the Phoenix appeared and caused the Great Flood cataclysm. Theopompus is dead right. Theopompus, a lot of people think Theopompus's reference here is a ancient reference to the Americas, because at that time the Americas were teeming with cities. They had not yet been destroyed. 31 BC had not happened yet. But yeah, it's a beautiful thing that Bellamy was aware of these things. And here's another one. Here's a shocker for those of you who have really been following the Archaix material. Here's a shocker. Hans Bellamy wrote that we know also that an Assyrian period ended in the year 712 BC. What? 713 BC. What happened, guys? Why am I a simulationist? Why do I hold so rigidly now to simulation theory? What happened in 713 BC that changed everything? And that couldn't have happened, but it did. We have all the proof in the world that it happened, but it couldn't have happened in a real Newtonian universe, in a real solar system. All the calendars changed, and yet nothing changed. It's amazing. I have several videos about 713 BC. Yeah, it's the year the sun went 10 degrees in retrograde. 185,000 Assyrians wearing armor were vaporized by a Fluxtube, a blast from the sky. Yeah, it's when all the calendars changed from 360 days a year to 365 days a year. And yet, the Nemesis X object and the Phoenix didn't change their periodicities. They maintained them. They maintained their chronological integrity, but the rest of the world and all its calendars was messed with. That's really interesting. So he goes off and says, the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 are only men from another body of deluge survivors, probably of superior race, who, roving the post-diluvian jungles, found mates in the women of a tribe that called itself the family of men. Even the ancient Greeks divided humans between those who considered themselves to be earthborn and the rest of humanity. Very interesting that Bellamy in 1931 didn't buy the religiosity, the Babylonianized Jewish version of the sons of God. that these great angels had sex with human women and gave birth to giants and all that. Bellamy translates that passage much like I do. The Anuna were humans, technologically sophisticated. They were survivors of a cataclysm, and they were all male when they landed in their ships. Therefore, they required local females. And the offspring of those local females were very much like the Anuna, or sons of God. Yeah, Bellamy, man. Bellamy impresses me because he never mentions Anunnaki. You know, it's way before Zecharia Sitchin. He never mentions any of that stuff, but he put the picture together based off all the data he had at the time. And that's very interesting. Man, something messing with my nose, guys. Okay, the first female being we read in the myths of the Jews, who was fashioned out of loam at the same time as Adam, was called Lilith. But she was intractable and would not subordinate herself to the will of her spouse, saying, "Are we not both made of the same substance?" Remember, you see, well, you have to understand, in this book he's explaining the loam, where it came from. It's the fallout that comes from the sky that our ancients thought was their ancestors liquefied. And it falls down as red rain and red mud all over the sky. And according to Bellamy, the ancients believed that material, that red mud that fell from the sky from the cataclysm, is what God scooped up, put together to make Adam and Eve. This is a profound belief. It's absolute proof that what I've told you guys, that Genesis chapter 1 is a reset story. It's not a creation. It's been masked as a creation by Jewish redactors. It's total reset. The world was absolutely destroyed. And here Lilith is throwing it in Adam's face. Are we not made from the same material, which is the organic compost left over from the world before? So this was not a bit to the liking of Adam, and he bitterly complained of his wife's stubbornness to his maker. So he was separated from her, and Lilith became a vampire, which preyed upon the offspring that Adam had from his second helpmeet, Eve. This is how Eve was created. God sawed Adam in two. With her, as she was flesh of his flesh and bone of his bone, then they got on very well. It's kind of choppy, but that's how he wrote it. Guys, what we have here is the demonization of a female who didn't get along, who wasn't going with the program. We have here an image, or the transposition of an older series of beliefs onto this newer Jewish belief. Lilith represents the goddess. Lilith is demonized into a vampire and a succubus. But that's only from a patriarchal perspective, of which the Jews maintained. So it's very interesting. This creation story pulls all these elements out, and that Hans Bellamy was able to put this together. So he says, the antediluvian shore dwellers seem to have been quite aware of the impending disaster and fully prepared for it. Some of them even built their arks on high ground so as not to have them dashed in pieces on the shore when the first huge breakers of the deluge rushed inland. They waited for the waters to rise and carry their well-appointed vessels away. The only reason I wanted to mention this, that Hans Bellamy did, is because I've told you guys in the past that the story of Noah and only 8 souls, it's a part of an ancient syllabus. It's where the Egyptians got their Ogdoad. It's the reason why this ancient syllabus was taught by the Amuru, and they spread it to all these different areas and kingdoms, but it's not true. It's not true that only one ark survived. Hans Bellamy knows it's not true either. It's right here. Many people knew that this was coming, the Phoenix, and they prepared for it, and many arks made it. And that's how our world was repopulated. Not by one, but by many. So we're talking about whole fleets. Again, this is a hint that things I've been telling you guys is true. We were technologically advanced before the flood. We were able to prepare, project, see all these things. We were probably running simulations then. Yeah, I love Hans Bellamy. Love this guy. Another thing he said that stood out, he says, the great fire still finds a distant echo. in the following the flaming sword of the angel before the gates of paradise. Now we know from my own research, I've showed multiple times that year one of the Annus Mundi calendar was 3895 BC. Also, independent of that analysis, independent of all these different chronologers that determine that as well. There's many of them that determine that 3895 BC. Not just Stephen Jones. There's several that 3895 BC was year one of the ancient world's calendar. Guys, that's when Phoenix appeared. In the Phoenix chronology, it's totally independent. Phoenix appeared in 3895 BC. Phoenix is what caused that reset. This is why Hans Bellamy keeps a distance from all this material. He's only mentioning these in passing, and he's very clear to let the reader know that the Great Flood and all the events of the pre-flood world, the building of the pyramid, of the Great Pyramid, and the Tower of Babel that was copied off of that, the model off of that original story. He says the great destruction that was the creation has nothing to do with what he's talking about. Yes, the cataclysm caused by the capture flood is something different, and we're going to get into it. Gotta love Bellamy, guys. He says the Arawaks of British Guiana say that the wickedness of mankind so enraged him who lives on high, Ioman Kandi, I guess that's the name of God, that he twice ordered a general destruction. First he scourged the world with fire, and then he flooded it with water. A few men, however, contrived to escape from each catastrophe. They found refuge from the fall of fire in underground caverns, while at the time of the Great Flood, the ancestral chief, Marijuana, it almost sounds like marijuana, and his followers were able to escape in a canoe. A flood of fire preceded the Great Flood, and there's a distance in time between these two events. So Bellamy here is telling us that humans lived in the underworld for a while. That's exactly what we find in Turkey, ancient Phrygia. It's Turkey today. I don't know. You could call it. It's gone. That area of the world is gone by so many different names. Lydia, Phrygia, Turkey, Hittite Anatolia. It's all the same area. That's where the 60 underground cities have been found since 1962. And remember, I told you in prior presentations, there is a legend that we have preserved of a king called Archaix, who foresaw coming calamity, and he built a city in the underworld, and he hid his people in it to save them from what was going on the surface. Yeah, I don't know. Hans Bellamy never cited that one, but he did cite a whole bunch of others. So, having gone through all that, I had to exhaust some of these ideas and concepts, because you've got to understand the mind of the individual we're dealing with here in order to appreciate the data that he brings to the table. Having now examined and found that Bellamy was indeed knowledgeable about the true history of the old world, that our predecessors did believe there was a time before the moon appeared, we will examine what he says about the capture flood. Bellamy says that we must recognize that these myths are by no means the wild conjectures of an ignorant age about the beginning of things. Rather, we must regard them as the finished, though much worn, much overgrown, outcome of close observation. Myths are not immensely exaggerated tales of local happenings, but matter-of-fact reports of universal events. Myths, to stress it once more, have a real material background and describe anti-historical happenings, of which only geology has up until now been able to give some account. He says the Tupi, this is the Native American people, they describe in their myths how the moon, with them, was the personification of all evil, falls periodically on the earth and destroys everything. Even nowadays, all baneful influences such as thunderstorms and floods are believed to be caused by that evil celestial body, the moon. No less an author than Aristotle tells us in his Constitution of Tegea that the barbarous Pelasgian aborigines who inhabited Arcadia before the coming of the Hellenes quoted as their chief title to the land the fact that they were already living in it before there was a moon in the heavens. Hence, the Greeks called them the Proselenians. Apollonius of Rhodes, we find a reference to the time when not all the orbs were yet in the heavens, when there were yet neither Danae or Deucalion's race, when only the Arcadians lived, of whom it is said that they dwelt on the hills before the moon appeared. For instance, the tribes of the Chickabaws and the you guys got to forgive me, I'm just not Native American. I can't even pronounce Muicasas, Mazcas, who inhabit the plateau of Bogota in the eastern Cordilleras of Colombia, definitely state that they remember a time before the present moon became the companion of our world. The Okanagan Indians have the following myth. A long time ago, when the sun was no bigger than an ordinary star, the heroine or semi-goddess Skomalt reigned over an island. When her subjects rebelled against her, she drove them all to a corner of her island, which she broke off and pushed into the sea. This is a description. The goddess she represents the moon. It is generally accompanied by a hieroglyph standing for the puma. Bellamy's talking about the moon in ancient Olmec Mayan reliefs. It is generally accompanied by the hieroglyph standing for a puma, a personification of evil, an indication that they feared the moon. So Bellamy wrote that man must have been fully man, an intelligent observer of nature, a skilled builder of ships and houses, a political being, by the end of the tertiary age, the time of the great breakdown of the predecessor of Luna. This means that the ascent of a definitely human stock must have taken place at a much earlier period. Now, I have to provide a little commentary on this. This is another reason why the scientific establishment was so vehemently against Hans Horbiger and Hans Bellamy. It's because the theory of evolution has us coming from primate hominids and primitive Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, and then gradually through the Neolithic we get smarter and smarter, more intelligent, and it takes us hundreds of thousands of years to become technologically advanced. Hans Bellamy is saying that according to the traditions and myths of the world and the archaeological record, things that we have actually found, the opposite is true. That we started technologically advanced and we have been knocked down from the pillars of knowledge that we once maintained, and that from cataclysm through cataclysm we keep getting knocked down more the more technologically advanced we get. So this is Hans Bellamy's position, and it's very good. Thus many people were fully prepared when the final cataclysm came and could escape death. From these survivors, a considerable number of deluge myths have come down to us. When the great capture flood came, this is their terminology, I did not make it up. When the great capture flood came, most people were more or less unprepared, for the measures taken with the lesser floods were useless in the face of it. Nevertheless, elaborate preparations must have been made by far-seeing rulers in certain parts of the world. In the foregoing pages, we have repeatedly referred to the high standard of civilization of the Diluvians. They built ships to escape the great flood. They dwelt in cities, and they reared star-pointing pyramids. They observed the heavens with minute care. The catastrophic capture of Luna threw man back almost to the beginnings of his technical career. Again, here's another inference by Bellamy that it was a cataclysm that took away man's technologies. My own commentary is insufficient to convey the magnitude of the following passages, so I'm going to read them to you, word for word. What an overwhelming and truly grandiose spectacle the capture of Luna must have presented to the beholder. One must picture the brightest of stars, far outshining Venus at its best, drawing nearer and nearer, increasing night after night in brilliance. On the eve of the capture, it appeared as a dazzling disk of, say, 1/8 of a degree in diameter. And that disk began to grow and grow before the awestruck spectators. It suddenly increased to twice, 4 times, 8 times, 16 times its size. At its capture, Luna must have had, for a short time, an apparent diameter of at least 1 degree, doubling the width we know now. But how closely the grand is related to the terrible. The teeming population of the lost lands, of whose shining cities all that has remained is a distant gleam in myth and fable, having crowded out of hut and palace and temple to witness the heavenly marvel, suddenly felt an icy fear, a nameless terror. The air was full of forebodings. An unknown God had revealed himself before their very eyes in magnificence and splendor. A sudden shock sent the trembling crowds to their knees. A series of tremors and throes flung them prostrate, groveling in the dust. And from above, from below, from all around, came a thundering, rumbling, roaring, raging voice, uttering great words in a dark tongue. The houses heard it and crashed. The trees shivered into splinters at its accents. The hills reeled and bowed their heads at its sound. The earth opened its womb and fire flashed forth. Blinding dust storms swept over the stricken multitudes. But the measure of their affliction was not yet full. Now the end came on. There rushed from north and south, advancing on a broad front, mountain-high waves, walls of water steeply reared. They swept over the land, seething, surging, tumbling, tossing, raging, roaring, burying all, proud prince, crafty priest, harmless citizen, in one deep, wet, cold grave. A few, very few, escaped. A man, perhaps, out of many thousands. But my tales of the lost world will fascinate the children born into the new tales of vast cities, of houses taller than several hundred of our miserable wattle and mud hovels, of swift locomotion on the water and on earth and in the air, of the fast and far transmission of the word, of all the 1,001 wonders of our time. I shall often be regarded as an idle romancer, and after several generations my tale of facts will have become a myth, a story which the simple believe literally, but the learned they deride, just as many of us deride the tales of our remote ancestors, such as the story of Atlantis. Imagination can easily complete this picture. It can also paint the frantic efforts of myself and my companions to save whatever there is to save of the science of the lost world, its arts, its technology. An almost hopeless task, for it will be difficult to rediscover the materials, to reinvent the methods, to make tools anew. How long will it be before our uncouth stone, bone, and wooden implements will be evolved? As for the getting of metals, I doubt if 1 generation suffices. And if the first generation, drawing on practical or theoretical knowledge, does not attain the efficient metal tool, the succeeding ones will find it extremely difficult, if not impossible. Guys, the point he's making is that when a cataclysm of this magnitude happens, it's a total infrastructure collapse. You're too busy trying to eat and shelter yourself to doing anything else. And if the infrastructure is collapsed, you can't make tools. Yeah, all you can do is make the most primitive tools. You can't make the tools that are really effective that will continue some type of infrastructure. You're going to make sticks and stones. That's all you're going to have. You're not going to be able to mine metals. You're not going to no metallurgy, no smelting, no casting, not turning it into make the type of tools that you need. This is what he's describing. It's very realistic that a total infrastructure collapse always follows a major cataclysm. If I imagine that a great and sudden cataclysm overtakes this busy hive of London, or the swarming canyons of New York, with the villages and hamlets of England, the backwoods settlements of America, and an unimaginably great and powerful tidal wave sweeps me and a few of my neighbors, a sorry crew with nothing to call our own except the shirts on our backs, to some strange place scoured clean by the raging waters, where is now our learning, our technical skill, our standard of culture? Though I may still remember a number of mathematical formulae, historical data, and general facts, of what value are they to me? Though I can make things out of wood and metal, unless I have the materials and the tools necessary, I can do nothing. Soon the pangs of hunger tell me that I am really alive, and I have to roam far and wide to pick up a few awful things, or the carcasses of drowned animals if I'm lucky. These I must hammer at with stones to get through the skin, and then I swallow some of the pounded raw flesh. This is very, it's graphic, but he's explaining in detail here what we experience in the human family by these cataclysms. Unless you're in the underworld, you cannot maintain your infrastructure. This is why the elite go down there. This is why we have those facilities. Not all of them are going to make it, but the ones that do have their engineering. They've got factories down there. They've got gardens. They've got light. They've got food. They can continue civilization. So Bellamy continues with an analysis of the book of Revelation. He's interpreting the book of Revelation from the perspective that is so, it boggles the mind when you marry it to the Archaix data. I believe we live in a simulation. I believe that simulation is on a loop. It just goes on over and over in loops. And I believe there's one definitive window in that loop. There's one small break in that loop that always happens that allows those who are prepared for it to jettison out, to make their escape, while everybody else goes back through the loop. It is my theory that the book of Revelation paints a picture of this loop. To find the same theory in Bellamy's material is shocking. He just says it in different ways because in 1931, the computer had not yet been invented. The frames of reference were different. In the Apocalypse, a myth has been preserved, which tells us that there was a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. Okay, he's quoting the book of Revelation. He's quoting the end book, the book of Revelation. He's making inferences throughout his entire text. Hans Bellamy is that the book of Revelation is only talking about a past event, an event that happened in the ancient world, and that event happens repetitively. Therefore, the prophecy is actually scientific. A lot of things have been attached to it, which he discusses. But although he believes the book of Revelation is describing a past event, he admits that it's inferring a future event right here. A new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. The loop has begun again. We're going right back to Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis chapter 1, here it is, new heaven, new earth, year 1, Annus Mundi. It all begins anew. The whole Adam and Eve narrative, the whole story I just told you about, Eve and Lilith, all this begins again. This is just the beginning of Bellamy's stuff. He says, in all deluge myths, whether of the eastern or the western hemisphere, whether told by peoples living near the poles or by tribes settling in the tropics, one fact always stands out. The Great Flood appears as the conclusion of a universal catastrophe, as the finale of a great cosmic drama. But though it definitely closes a period, it does not cause the final end of things. After the deluge comes the creation. It is a remarkable fact that the mythologist, though he knows an immense number of creation myths, cannot point to a single one whose report starts right at the beginning of things. In real myths, creation out of nothing is nowhere thought of. Creation ex nihilo. Almost everywhere we find the ordering of a chaotic muddle of pre-existing materials. We can now make another attempt to render Genesis chapter 1 through 2 in clearer language. What is expressed by these two verses is something like this. In the beginning of the present eon, the Elohim conquered a primeval bisexual chaos monster, Tohu Wabohu, in its primary meaning. In those days, the earth as we know it was not yet created. Only a primeval ocean and a primeval landmass existed. The Bohu land sank into the Tohu waters when the deluge came after the undoing of the Tohu Wabohu dragon. The breakdown products of the dying satellite spread a dense pall of darkness over the Tehom. Tehom is Hebrew. It comes from the Babylonian Tiamat, the chaos dragon, from which, according to the Babylonians, our world was created. The Bible starts with a scant amount of the creation of heaven and earth. It ends with a detailed vision of the end of this heaven and this earth, and the making of a new heaven and a new earth. Bellamy's not saying that we're on a loop, but Bellamy is describing a loop perfectly. He cites a biblical passage in the book of Revelation that I thought was pretty interesting too. He said, and he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, for all nations and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins. I want to explain here. Bellamy is describing, he's saying that the author of the Revelation record is describing the world as Babylon. I've showed you that in the Revelation it says the world is both Babylon and Sodom, like Sodom and Gomorrah. But this right here is exactly what I've told you guys about the Exodus event happens in the middle of the apocalypse. The Exodus event is when all the redeemed, the chosen, the elect, the meek, that's when they make their escape from what's going on during the apocalypse. They are freed from their avatars, and when they're in their avatar do they suffer the things of the apocalypse and of the beast kingdom. But they're freed, and here it is right here. When the apocalypse is destroying Babylon, the world, it says right here, Come out of her, my people. It's not talking about the damned, and it's not talking about those who are going to go right back into the loop. It's talking about the errant. It's talking about the spiritual people who are ready to exit this holography. Come out of her, my people. Yeah, I thought that was profound when I seen that Bellamy made that connection. That come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins. It's time for you to exit the simulacrum. It's exactly what's being described. So, taking everything into consideration, we get the impression that the apocalypticians, I love that word, that the apocalypticians did not invent the cosmological skeleton of their stories, but based them on popular traditions of great antiquity. Their descriptions are too grand, too lofty, too logical, too clear to be merely the outcome of imagination. The presence of passages inconsistent with the tone and character of the whole has been taken by many scholars as evidence against the literary unity of the work. But from the foregoing considerations, the single authorship seems to be again admissible and acceptable. What answers this anomaly the scholars have isolated is that, as I've shown you in the Archaix output, the Old Testament and the book of Revelation, even the New Testament, these maintain fragments of older works. Therefore, it's very hard to just say that it's all BS, because those older works have been found in many cases, like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish and the Karsag tablets. And the Keto Larimore tablets. We find these all frequently. We find evidence that the biblical material was copied from an older source. So what Bellamy is inferring here is that somebody very carefully put the biblical material together, at least the book of Genesis and the book of Revelation, very carefully put it together using pre-existing writings and all that stuff. And it's the evidence of its choppy nature in different writing styles, and the syntax shows that these were actually pieces of compositions that far antedate the books themselves. So, yeah, Hans Bellamy is just, the man's a genius, there's no doubt. So, another peculiarity is that the writer, while mentioning many of the grotesque agents of the Great Cataclysm in the book of Revelation, never describes them exactly, but only hints at their shape and appearance, or the noise they make. Something appeared in heaven like unto the Son of Man. Now, something appeared in heaven similar to beasts, a lion, a calf, a man, a flying eagle, and again, like unto is used over and over and over throughout the Revelation record. This is not common in other biblical books. So, also the phrase "as it were" and "like" is over and over and over used. As it were a trumpet. He gives a lot of examples. The book of Revelation is describing one thing, but using words that hint that it's actually meaning something else. Over and over and over and over, the things that it's describing are mundane, ordinary things, but it's always prefaced with "like," "as it were," or it's evidence that the author is intending to mask what he's really talking about. And that, according to Hans Bellamy, the book of Revelation is about a cataclysm that destroys our world, and that some people make their escape, while a lot do not. And that this cataclysm is ordained to be the new heavens and new earth. And that we're on a loop. It's all here. Just the frames of reference are a little different. He says the apocalyptician projected the events of the dim past into the indefinitely near future, and did so rightly. Therefore, both the preterists and the futurists among the scholars are both correct in their views. That's amazing. Hans Schindler Bellamy is one of my personal heroes. Love the man. The book is awesome. And he wrote his book not to build himself up on a pedestal. He wrote his book, Moons, Myth, and Mars, to defend Hans Horbringer, who could not defend. He was already old. Who could not defend himself against the scientific community that was now trying to take apart his new theory. So in summary, we're dealing with two men that promoted a theory and supported it, showing that there was a moon in the ancient world long before the moon we have now. And that, yes, maybe in tertiary times, maybe 13,000 years ago, whenever, it fell to Earth. It was the real moonfall. And it's the reason we have all these unique materials on our topsoil. Now, it was thousands of years later that another moon appeared, and when it appeared, it wrecked shop. It tore our world all up. It completely collapsed a technologically advanced civilization, which is something I have said from the beginning. From the beginning, I have showed you guys my Anuna timelines, my lunar timelines, my Anno Luna timeline, my Anunnaki nerd timelines, Phoenix holography, every bit of it. I've had these published for years. And the appearance of the moon did cause a cataclysm. And it was before the phoenix appearing that started year one Annus Mundi. So this concludes my video, my presentation. I'm sorry it was so long, but we had to go into this depth. The book is 356 pages. It's very technical. And it had to be. It had to be. Both men were uniformitarians. But were they? We have nothing but evidence of catastrophism here. But it's okay. They had to present their theory as a uniformitarian treatise in order to even be regarded, even be read by other scientists. But I don't care. I don't care about that because their hearts were in the right place. And it's just really intriguing how Hans Bellamy was able to study the legends and myths of the world and determine all these things for which I've shown evidence for. We have been technologically advanced multiple times. I tell you guys a lot. It only takes 200 years to go from Hadron Collider. To go from horse and buggy to Hadron Collider. So this was Moons, man. I'm really having trouble talking right now, aren't I? Moons, Myths, and Man by Hans Bellamy in defense of Hans Horbiger of the cosmic ice theory.